Alrighty, let's jump right in. Again, thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Precious Osai, and I am the instructor manager for the Cannabis Training Academy here in New Jersey. Today, we are jumping into our level 9, level up your cultivation skills, SOPs for sustainable and compliant operations with our level 9 instructor, Jason Gully. We're going to have a great conversation. You guys can join in where we're really going to dive into just how to really build those SOPs around cultivation and a little bit about what cultivation looks like in a practical way, especially here in New Jersey. So, for all you guys that are pursuing a cultivation license or thinking about it, this is a great opportunity to get into some of the nooks and crannies of how do you build this out. Cultivation sometimes feels like the belly of the beast, right? A huge undertaking. But I've seen Jason at work, and he really makes it seem super easy, seamless, can do it in his sleep at this point. So we'll jump in there. But before we begin, again, just want to welcome you all. We hope that you're having a good journey through the CTA courses. If you are ever having questions or if you're ever stuck anyway, please make sure you're hitting up our help and support desk. You can also email cta@sos.nj.gov for questions and queries about your journey. No matter where you are, whether you are just starting your application program or you are in the process of building out, we hope that this program services you and that you can find some value in that. So please feel free to leave back any feedback you have after this. The chat is open, so definitely put in there where you're calling from. And if you have any questions, we'll take them throughout the conversation, if not towards the end. So with that, I'm going to introduce our instructor, rather let Jason introduce himself. Man, myth, legend. Jason Gully, thank you for joining me. We're gonna get a little background about you.
Thanks, everybody. Precious, thank you for your time. Team, I'm glad you're all here. So a little bit about me. I started my licensed cannabis journey September 19th, 2009. So I've been doing this for a few years. I've been licensed in over 11 different states, setting up cultivation facilities, both as private license and as public licenses, single state operators, and as an MSO. So, this process of helping everybody achieve operational stability with their SOPs, I'm here to help, and I look forward to this.
Nice, thanks. So again, your course, if you can just explain it a little bit, we really dive in about SOPs for the cultivation. So a lot of what is done in the front work, right? Or the back work rather, before you actually start to build out and get started. Can you talk to us a little bit about what folks can find in your course?
Yeah, so really, when we think about cultivation SOPs, from a very top level, I want you to think about it as a document that can speak for you when you're not there. So
Yeah.
that talks about the things that you need to be thinking of, whether it's the people, the locations, the equipment that they're using, or the process that they're actually going to be going through.
Yeah.
All of these documents that we're talking about get you from conceptualizing what you will be doing all the way down to making sure that you hit your model. And if you didn't hit your model or you need to make adjustments in your demand plan, these are the ways that you would look at it.
Yeah, thanks. So just starting at the very beginning, let's say you want to enter into the cultivation space as a new licensee here in New Jersey. When you're putting together that SOP, what are you thinking about when you're selecting the cultivation facility? Because one of the things you have to do, especially on the municipal side, is explain your premises.
Mm-hmm.
Cultivation can be specific because you need things like water, electricity. How do you really find a chef's kiss location for cultivation?
Well, I think you got to think about the things that are necessary. You named off a lot of utilities that are extremely important. Location, location, location. Not only is it for, of course, those things that you need to make the plant survive, power, water, those utilities, but also what businesses are surrounding your area from a security standpoint, from an environmental standpoint. Is there something that's a farmer that may be close to your outdoor crop that might be spraying a pesticide that is 100% allowed in their process of agriculture, but any sort of drift over could be a contamination aspect in what you're looking at. So really, take the time to think about your zoning, your compliance aspects, all the way into your security of your building and your people and your property, into what environmental factors will I need to think about? Am I in a hot zone where no matter what, my air conditioning is going to be more expensive because I have to cool it to this? Am I
Yeah.
in a zone that's outdoor with low light that I'm going to need to add more things to it?
Really quickly, because Jersey allows for both indoor and outdoor cultivation. Are there huge differences there when you're putting together your SOP plans and when you're trying to find a facility to set up shop?
From a conceptual standpoint, no, but from a very minute standpoint, yes. There are things that you're going to need to think about more so, especially when it comes to an outdoor environment. You have less degrees of control than you do in an indoor facility. That being said, you have to put in certain things in place to counteract those risk factors.
Nice. And I know indoor takes a little bit more control because you're working with lights, you're working with power, you're working with water. I mean, you do the same thing with outdoor, but you're letting a little bit of the elements take control there. When you're building your SOP, it just seems like such a huge undertaking to write these concepts on paper. What are some of the first things you look to when you have to create SOPs for cultivation?
Yeah, sure. Great. So the facility design will dictate a lot of the operational aspects. For
Mhm.
example, how many flowering rooms you have can be a leading indicator of how often you plan on harvesting. How many dry cure rooms you have can be a leading indicator for how much time you have in that space, whether you need to do quick movements or whether you have enough time for a full process in a single stage without changing location. So really, the very first thing that you should look at outside of the actual location itself is, what does my design look like? And how will that design give me the output that justifies the business case?
And what are some common oversights folks usually don't catch when you're doing that facility setup and like trying to design it out for compliance reasons?
Yeah, I would say probably the most frequent thing that I see that makes me
Yeah.
laugh is when I see register intake and an exhaust right next to each other in a cultivation, short cycling. Ultimately, the
Mhm.
problem with that is although the air conditioner is running, your room isn't getting colder. You're spending the
Mm.
money trying to fix the problem, but the design aspect was what was wrong. That's where before you build, make sure you have time to thoroughly walk your plan and make sure that it makes sense conceptually, not just on paper.
Yeah. Now, moving forward, let's say you get your facility, you've kind of met the local zoning rules. You don't have the exhaust situation where you're not getting any cooling. What are some next steps you're taking to build out some of those SOPs? Is it now more looking into equipment, how you would run day to day? Do you have to include some of those like nitty gritty stuff, like even your entire harvest cycle? It just seems like a huge undertaking when I think about it. Like, what would I immediately do next if I have my facility um, spelled out for me?
Well, first, what I would suggest is looking at a market analysis, and that is
Nice.
even going into your location. See what makes sense for you from a market standpoint. Then, once you have your market analysis in an ideal situation, that will also tell you what the state of New Jersey as a global area, what they want to see in their cannabis. Is it a
Right.
certain quality brand standard? Is it a certain price point? How much of those things do you think you can sell within your rotationary period? And
Yeah.
I'm a big believer, I build demand plans and I work backwards and forwards from that,
Right.
not from a supply driven model, but from a demand driven model.
Makes sense. So really you're saying like look at what the market is presenting in terms of what products are selling, what's moving, because there we hear of these huge cultivation facilities that has all this canopy space. And sometimes I think to myself, is all of this leaving like after their full harvest cycle, drying, trimming, everything when they pack it out, is all of that product gone in then like a month or so? And then they're starting up that next harvest cycle. Is that what you're referring to as well? Like just managing that timing?
It is. And so, like, actually, that timing leads to what I would consider discounting. And as your
Mhm.
product gets older, the cheaper it will become because it needs to
Mhm.
fit into the market segment. And as more
Right.
products available, you need to start thinking about what does overproduction look like to you. That can lead into what is your strain assortment? How many different brands are you going to be producing?
Mhm.
Ultimately, trying to get you, my advice is always try and be in an area where what you produce and what you
Mhm.
sell always stay in the 0 to 30 bucket.
Question, because you worked with a bunch of different cultivators just around the country. How often do they refer to their SOPs after they've been built out and everything? Like, do they really serve as this guide, or do you end up having to do a lot of one-offs that you didn't think about because you didn't really spell it out in your SOP?
Great question. And so I think an SOP as a living document, meaning that you will always have version control. And part of being GMP SOP is having that version control.
Yeah.
And every single time you make that adjustment, the proper steps to have that track and traceability so that you don't change back to a previous version that you already know doesn't work.
Yeah. And how do you then get so moving on to staff, and you're building out your staff as you're building out your facility? What sort of trainings are there to make sure that your staff understand and know the SOPs, especially because you have staff doing different things? If you can actually walk through what some of those staffing looks like
Mhm.
for a cultivation, because I know you also have to list that in your SOPs.
Yeah, yeah. So that kind of goes down to the business case. And when I say that, when we look at labor, I like to look at labor as a percentage of my net sales. Because from a business standpoint, you should always be monitoring everything that you do against your net sales, whether it's expenses or labor in this choice. And
Right.
how do you decide, are you overstaffed? Are you understaffed? What is the right capacity for your facility?
Yeah.
And oftentimes I end up building capacity models so that we can monitor the days, the hours per shift. And let's just
Mhm.
say it's an 8 hour shift, 5 days a week. As we expand the facility, do we then move to 4 10s, ultimately leading us to an AM and a PM working 20
Mhm.
hours a day? And when you think about your capacity, as you start looking at your ROI on your building, your ROI on your equipment, your labor, all of your products, as you start looking at that, those numbers are what will lead you to the decision of, are you overstaffed or are you understaffed?
Right. And then even when I'm thinking about staffing, and even as I'm thinking about SOPs, you just brought to mind like just micro versus full, especially here in New Jersey, because there is that canopy cap on the micro licensees. Do these have a huge impact in what goes in your SOPs? I like to think all the processes are the same, but on micro level, you don't have the same capacity. So when you're talking about staffing, when you're probably talking about, just how many plants you're even able to have in there, does that change in your SOPs?
It does to a degree. In fact, usually when I look at from a standpoint in the very beginning, when we first look at our floor plan, is I'll look at the flowering room, total
Mhm.
flowering room space, to the canopy space that is within the flowering room. That's
Mhm.
length times width. If you're using tables, it's very easy for us to measure this. Ultimately, that gives us a efficiency ratio of the actual flower room design.
Yeah.
And if, for example, you're 65% or less on that efficiency ratio, I would suggest reworking that. Um,
Mhm.
as you get closer to 73, 75%, because again, you have to think about OSHA and 3 foot clearance around all perimeters.
Yeah.
It's important that you lay your facility out well so that you can measure against your capacity for your
Yeah.
canopy.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about equipment and like use of equipment and all that really goes into that cultivation facility after you sort of sorted out some of these. I think it's very important that like folks are trained in what they're doing in cultivation facilities because, this is like the belly of the beast when I think of like this is the products that's going into the market that either gets extracted or whatever. Things will always come back to a cultivation that's not really being careful to make sure that their products aren't safe and done properly. So how do you maintain like safety and integrity of the product by like just making sure that the team and the equipment you have is up to snuff?
Well, great question. And part of that is your equipment maintenance schedule.
Mm,
And you're going to want to make sure that you have that for all of your equipment. One, because anything that you spend money on, you want to take good care of it because it'll last longer, especially in a
yeah,
cultivation. We're extremely
yeah,
hard on things. And the more thorough you can be on your training, especially when it comes to pieces of equipment, always ask the manufacturer for their manufacturing guidelines because you want to make sure that you use the tools within the spec that they have. Otherwise, you could void a warranty unexpectedly.
nice. And when you're like thinking about your equipment, is it necessary for you to in your SOPs kind of list out the equipment you plan to use, any changes in
Yes.
equipment? Like you said, it's a living document. Maybe you upgrade equipment because isn't
Mhm.
there maybe going to be like a learning curve? Like how do you go about putting that within the SOP?
Well, first, before you update your SOP, you should make sure that you submit whatever piece of equipment it is to your CRC field monitor and get
Hmm.
their approval in respect to that piece of equipment. Because if you go build out an entire process, they come on site and say, for whatever reason it's not sanitary, you can't use it, then you just wasted a lot of time and money. So
Yeah.
really think about your steps before you perform any process.
Nice. Um, One thing about cultivation that I think usually surprises folks is that you can use a lot of automation in there in terms of like temperature control,
Mhm.
and building out processes when you're thinking about the harvest cycle. Can you talk to me a little bit about the harvest cycle? Can you like fundamentally break it down for folks? I think this is one of my favorite parts
Sure, sure,
about
sure.
just the process you go to from when you put a
Yeah.
seed in the ground versus then getting it finished product. I think that when I got to know that step by step, it put cultivation in a better context for me. And I don't think a lot of people know just all that goes in between because that helps you plan better. Like helps you plan more efficiently.
Mhm.
And after that's a two-parter, after you list out that process, can you talk about how important it is to have someone who understands that harvest cycle for how you maintain your full practice, your full operation, and what sort of things you've seen that can maybe throw things off and make it difficult for you to operate? It's a three-parter.
So yeah, no, and also great questions on that. I think the the belief that you should have when it comes to this is if you care about something in cultivation, you should find a way to monitor it. So let's start about
Mhm.
some automation things. Typically, when people talk automation and cultivation, it always starts with fertigation systems. It's
Yeah,
extremely important to understand what it is that you are feeding your plants,
yeah.
and that process and the media that the plants are in and how it will be uptaken. Now, to that, how would you monitor it? Well, you should have, in a best case scenario, if the budget allows, there are substrate sensors that you can use that will measure not only the pH, but the EC of the cube or the base of the media that the plant is in. That will allow you to monitor against your growth period so that you know when fertigation events need to happen. Steps farther even into the process, whether it's automation with lights dimming, whether it's CO2 injection into your room as a certain ramp up and ramp down throughout the week cycle into harvest. Now, one of the things that I personally think is a very important step in harvest is if you have the budget, there are tools that allow you to monitor the environment of the product within a dry cure room. Meaning, in New Jersey, we use water analysis. It's an extremely important percentage that tells you the bioavailability or bioactivity of water within a substrate, or in this case, cannabis, ultimately
Right.
leading to potential of microbial.
Mhm.
By dialing that process, you can actually quantify each one of the days in the dry cure so that you know from a checkpoint analysis when that product should move from that dry cure room into, for example, a trim stage or a buck stage, and then into a trim stage. And those
Mhm.
quantification points over time, as part of your SOP, allows you to stay within a standard of expectation.
Mm. Nice. And I like that you say standard of expectation because I don't think people realize that growing is dialed in to a science where folks know what their yielded harvest is going to be from
Mhm.
plants they put in the ground because again that makes strategic business decisions on what your sales are going to be and what products you're able to be to put out into the market. So just part of the other question is what are some things you've seen that like folks have missed in terms of like building out their harvest cycle, figuring out where to dial things in to get like a superior yield? What is some of those oversights that you want folks to kind of focus in on and should be really like putting in your SOPs?
So, and I might get some flack on this one, but this is my personal opinion.
Mhm.
Sometimes I've seen people cultivate varieties within a facility that they change the facility's timelines to perfect the variety.
Mm,
Now, my personal stance is when you design your facility, you design it with a certain number of days in flower,
mm,
and you pick the varieties that match your facility because you're a commercial operation at this point.
yeah.
You're not in an artesian small room. You have a fiduciary duty to your business partners to make the most happen. And this is part of that process of
Mm,
building the business to be a long term surviving entity.
nice. I want to also talk a little bit about QA/QC. For those that
Mhm.
don't know what I'm referring to, it means quality assurance and quality control. That is a huge part of the cultivation world. How do you sort of write out how you will make sure that your QA/QC standards would prevent any product inconsistencies or contamination? for what you're producing? How do you really put that in SOP? And what should you be really looking out for? What should be on that checklist, really, Jason?
So first, very first thing you should build is what your brand standards are. What does the product that you plan on packaging look like to you? Is it a potency? Is it of THCA? Is it of the terpenes? What meets your standard first? Then
Mhm.
transparency. If you see something, say something. If you see some product that has debris or foreign material in it, at that point, you should say something to your shift lead, your team lead, and you should let them know that you found something. At that point, more than likely, what will happen is that batch, that product, will be isolated and put into a quarantine like state until it has had enough time to be vetted and the next steps have been chosen on what that product is, whether it's a retest or other more significant action steps. But ultimately, by knowing that if you see something, whether it's foreign debris or seeds,
Mhm.
saying something so that that product doesn't meet the consumer is extremely important.
No, I highly agree. Trust me. I think cultivations have a hard time calling themselves out of a recall
Mm-hmm,
than like just preventing it. I think the investment in prevention, my dad always said prevention is better than cure. This is
mm-hmm,
explicitly important to the cultivation market because trust me, for business owners, which a lot of you guys on this call are either are or hope to be, clawing yourself out of a recall is quite difficult. So having that QA/QC checklist and creating an SOP that monitors that things are going to be checked before they're going out into the market is quite important. Um, Jason, I also want to talk a little bit about like compliance in cultivation. Feels like
mm-hmm,
you guys have a lot to be compliant of because again, this is like at the top of the food chain. This is
mm-hmm.
where rubber meets the road with the products that most people are going to consume. How do you really? Because the state gives us a lot of guidance, right, through their rulemaking and just what the license type is supposed to be. How do you regurgitate that you will be compliant when you're writing out your SOPs for that?
Of course. Well, honestly, so I think the right answer to that is you need to look inward at your business and say, what are the KPIs? What are the activities that we want to do? Because most
Mhm,
often, all of the compliance aspects are already part of those much larger KPIs that you want to report on anyway. So,
mhm,
how do you maintain that? Well, things to think about. Current state, New Jersey, it's a metric based state. So, you will have
mhm,
metric tags. There are pieces of equipment that can help you with plant counts, for example, an outlaw wand. I see the states use those. But
mhm,
manual audits are important.
mhm.
Counting. I would tell you that probably one of the most amazing things I have seen is sending 5 different cultivators into a room to count all of the plants and coming back with 5 different counts.
See?
So important that we understand our operation.
Mhm,
One, because that plant count ultimately is going to lead into your demand plan, ultimately into your end result. And if you were supposed to have a certain plant count and you are already less than that, no matter what you do, you will not hit the end result on your demand plan. So there's
mhm.
already red flags starting to pop.
When you talk about counting, I'm also thinking about canopy size, right?
Mm-hmm.
Let's say you start off just, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, huge space, and you've built it into your SOPs that you'll be able to create flower rooms to occupy this cultivation. What if that's not the case? Have you seen instances where folks can either revert the canopy size to, like you said, meet the demand plan? And if so, that's something that could be written in an SOP.
Yeah, so I mean, there are different things that you can do. Usually, when it comes to that, what I would do is I would look at the strains that are going to be going into this particular room that fits into my total canopy, and I would
Mhm.
say which one of these varieties will yield me the less revenue, and those would be the
Mm,
varieties I would axe out of that and grow the rest of it to the canopy spacing. Or what I would do is I would adjust my plant spacing, plants per
mhm.
square foot, to absorb more of that space, less plants. Potentially, if I was doing this, if I was overcrowded and I was fighting a microbial issue, that would be a
Yeah.
strategy that I would use.
Just switching gears a little bit, I want to talk about some of like the end product in cultivation. So kind of
Mhm.
taking our hat off of just SOPs, just cultivation in general because you're talking about like the different strain selections, the different cultivars. How important is folks that are in the cultivation space to understand genetics, strains? How do you find out what's selling really great here versus what might be selling really great in another market? Is that something you think cultivation applicants should really be aware of, or students of, if they want to get into this part of the game?
Yeah, my advice is to grow with intent. And when I say that, I mean if you're going to be working with a manufacturing license, and that manufacturing license is solvent based, then you're going to be growing specific cultivars that would be known to have a higher yield than
Mhm.
other cultivars specifically for that. Similarly, though, if I was growing for a hydrocarbon or an ethanol based, I would do adjustments based on the products I knew they were going to make. Again, growing with intent, knowing what the end product will be, and making sure that your selection optimizes that potential.
And speaking of that selection, what are you kind of seeing in the markets that are doing really well in terms of what consumers are like? And also, your question, I can ask you this because you worked on a different coast. Is there a big difference between what consumers are engaging with on the West Coast versus what you're seeing they're engaging with in the East Coast? Because I have a theory, but I wanted to hear yours.
Well, we can look at a couple of different aspects on that. One, we can just
Mhm.
say generalized terpenes.
Yeah.
You see a lot of things start on the West Coast as trends that then move to the East Coast. That can be trends and varieties as well. With that, I would say that a lot of times the piece to think about when you're selecting these varieties is not looking at the variety first, but looking at the metrics or the KPIs, whether it's yield, it's time, it's potency, and making sure that that fits within your facility. Because I see a lot of people get so excited and so bought into a particular genetic that just does not work with their facility. And
Mm.
they try all of these different things and ultimately spent a lot of time and energy on something that is not going to be commercially viable.
Nice. I definitely seen a little bit of a trend here where it seems like New Jersey, East Coast rather, really high on sativas, like you said, like really high on the terps, versus West Coast seems to have like 'cause sativas do well there as well, but you also see indicas also pulling away. Are those trends to kind of monitor? You talk about a demand plan a little bit. Can you kind of break that down for me?
So, okay, so actually, I would say this goes into my R&D selection of varieties. And when I select varieties, the first thing I ask myself is, what am I missing from my market? Goes back to my
Mhm.
market analysis. Let's say that we'll deal with the ish, the indica sativa hybrid. Let's say that something tells me that we have not enough sativa in the marketplace.
Mhm.
What I traditionally think now, based on that response, is that what the marketplace is looking for is something that's high in terpinolene, limonene, pinene, not immersing, caryophyllene,
Mhm.
humulene, or linalool. So when I select or when I think about the indica sativa hybrid, I actually am thinking to myself about a menu that we can create for the customer experience that
Mhm.
has the terpene profiles that would represent those ish qualities
Yeah.
from a consumer's perspective that fit within our cycle time. So I don't have to have a 12-week sativa. I can find a 9-week that fits within the terpene profile I'm looking for.
Nice. And it feels like all of this can be also broken into your financial or your pro forma plans. I know that we have courses here that teach you how to build that out. You guys can check out level 5 financial forecasting taught by Devin McLaren. But it also seems like knowing those specific or knowing that demand plan, being able to build that out can translate into what your financial projections can look like for your cultivation. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Your demand plan is basic. So from a P&L standpoint, you have
Hmm.
profit and you've got costs.
Right.
Your harvest schedule represents all of your profit as it happens each month that you realize
Hmm.
revenue, dumps right into it. Your costs associated for each one of those months of production, the
Hmm.
bottom part of your P&L. And that's how you should think about designing your demand plan.
Nice. I'm going to switch over. We have a question here in the chat or in the Q&A box. And again, feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A box or in the chat, and we'll be happy to get to them. It says, let's say I want to get into cultivation, but I think I may need to grow at home in a legal state, of course, like New York or Virginia. Is there anything home grow could teach me at a small scale that would prepare me for a license? Could I make home grow SOPs that would translate to a larger cultivation SOPs? Are those like drastically different?
Depends on the size of the home grow.
Mm,
But I would say that it's hard to translate some of the practices that you would use at home into the capacity of a facility. And the reason why is the scalability of what you're doing in a small grow. Uh, and even in a micro, it's much larger than most people are operating on. And that's where the size and scalability. Now, from a standard plant physiology and botany, I think it is good. I think it's good to grow plants in general.
mm,
It gives you an ability to understand what the process of cloning looks like. What does a flowering plant look like? These things
yeah,
can take and demystify some of the curious aspects early on.
yeah. I have about two more questions for you before we wrap up soon. One is about GMP certification.
Mhm.
Can you break that down to me a little bit? Because I know there's some cultivations that are, I know some cultivations that are not. Is this a requirement in New Jersey? Can you just kind of like fundamentally explain to me what happens with being GMP certified?
Yeah, GMP certified is what I consider very important. And it's a process. And also, it is a certifiable event. So, for example, this year, if you're GMP, next year you'll need to be recertified as well. Ultimately, that standard of compliance or characteristic can be a selling factor for you to all of your customers as well. It would signify to me that your facility would be a natural touring showcase for investors as well as buyers to come in and show them how clean and how standardized your operating facility is. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
Also, if you ever plan on operating in multiple states or multiple jurisdictions,
Mm-hmm.
having that thought process already ingrained in the way that you operate will allow you to enter any of these new jurisdictions at a much easier pace.
I want to talk a little bit about for some of the folks that are, let's say, new into the cultivation space, want to get into this license type. How much should be outsourced? You talk about people to help you grow, build out these plans. What are your recommendations in building your team if you're not necessarily the one with the green thumb, for the lack of better words?
I think it's important to have a team around you that, one, you can trust that what they say they will do, because when you're not there, you're relying that they're following your SOPs. And I think that's important for you to think about scalability as your team grows from a phased approach potentially into multiple phases in your same facility. As your team grows, looking at the people from a leadership standpoint and thinking to yourself as ultimately the leader of the company, how can I strengthen or sharpen their strengths? Ultimately leading them to be a much better employee or a teacher or a leader to the team members, because it's a place you have to work with everybody all the time, and
Mhm.
having a environment like that makes it more rewarding.
Yeah, nice. I really like that answer. Because I think there are a lot of misconceptions and myths around like the capabilities around just waking up one day and saying, I want to launch a cultivation
Mm-hmm.
facility. Um, so for some first timers, what are some things you would like to give off as like maybe debunking myths or something that they should really think about or steer clear from when it comes to wanting to get into this business?
Budgets are important. Start with your budget.
Mm. Yeah.
It's really easy to spend a lot of money if you're not paying attention to the details. More than that, a lot of the bigger items have long lead times. So you need to think about what's going to happen when it's here, what will be your capacity to commission the equipment, how will that work from not only a standpoint of do you have plants in the ground and this is in a later phase? How will you bring construction people through the facility? How will you make sure that they have adequate supervision from a badged perspective while they're in the facility? Really important details.
Are there any other sort of like myth busters you can think about?
I mean, I'm sure I can think about a bunch of myth busters. Cultivation's great. It's a wonderful journey. Keep your eyes open and think about what you're doing, and know that there's a million ways to do it. And how do you know if your way is right is if your business is successful. To me, ultimately, that means keeping a schedule of expectations
Mhm.
and being able to monetize the input so that we can continue the business for another month consistently.
Yes. Actually, I want to get into one more segment. And again, if you guys have any other questions or want to drop any questions in the Q&A box or chat, feel free to do so while we have this master of a mind here in cultivation. You really don't get it this dialed in when you think about how to be just operationally sound and successful in cultivation. So again, Jason, thank you for your time. I want to talk a little bit about auditing and record keeping in cultivation because it feels like a lot of data, a lot of inputs, a lot of outputs. Especially if you ever get an investigator or say, hey, we're coming to do an audit. First of all, what does that SOP look like? What are you writing out to say this is what you will follow? Number two,
Mhm.
how do you prepare for our audit? And like, what does record keeping or sound record keeping really look like in a cultivation facility?
Yeah, so I look at it in two different ways. I look at it as a bioasset, anything that's alive. So that's going to be
Mhm.
plant counts, things like that for your clones. What height are they? Because at that time it'll reflect tagging. Um, then going into actual like product. Once we're into dried product, it goes to weights. Weights goes
Mhm.
from bulk product into individual units. Units and weight all can count. Ultimately, although the best practice is at a minimum a singular monthly full audit, we
Mhm.
create paperwork and log that tracks everything. That way, we know if it's in a room and it moves from one location to another location, we can track that not only physically, but also in our ERP. Making sure that your system has the capability, of course, Metric will track this as well, but making sure that you know room movements. So when the state comes to audit your facility, what they will have is access to Metric. So whatever
Mhm.
Metric says, your facility needs to represent. So preemptively, self-auditing is important. And that's
Yeah.
part of maintaining compliance as well as just staying on top of your game.
Yeah. And speaking of just more compliance and auditing, what does security look like for a cannabis cultivation facility? Sometimes I feel like this is more security than any of the other license types. How do you kind of create a SOP to build out your security infrastructure for your cultivation facility?
Well, I think about that from a floor plan perspective. Oftentimes what you can do is use QR codes, and you can literally print these off and stick them on different sections of your facility and have a tracking program. So as your security agent does rotationary periods across the facility, they hit each one of those QR codes, ultimately letting you know that that has been completed. Um, Anytime you have somebody coming to your facility, I make sure that security is there to not only greet them, ensure that the proper documentation has been signed, and as you start operating your facility, you may be giving grow tours. And when you give a grow tour, you're going to want to make sure that you have, for example, a slip and fall document to make sure that in the event something happens, you're not liable. I also recommend having, and anytime I let a buyer come, usually they'll have a marketing agent with them and they'll want to take pictures and video, which I highly suggest, with the clause that I have the ability to have final say on the content, and anything that needs to be edited can be edited before it's used for social media or any other purpose. Ultimately, security is responsible for making sure that those documents are signed. We have those copies before they pass the lobby.
Yeah. And these are all things, folks, that you can literally write out and put into your SOP so that your
Mhm.
team are following it step by step. It doesn't have to feel like this overwhelming undertaking when you put it into a document and you are able to teach your team through trainings. It all feels doable. We have a couple questions here in the Q&A box. One, I love this question. What is metric?
Marijuana enforcement tracking system. It is the seed to sale system that New Jersey uses for its auditing purpose. It is the window into our operations from the state's perspective. Um, it is something that you'll be using on a daily basis. The tags that you use for your plants are metric tags. So when you go through the process of approval for operation, you'll have to take a metric class. That metric class is where you'll sign up and give them a credit card so that you can buy your first tags. Um, they're inexpensive and it's mandatory and they don't expire. So some perks on that. But it is something you will absolutely have to operate within the standards of.
Mhm. Do you have to create a metric SOP for your cultivation facility, or is that just something that comes with, the training that you said that they offer?
So usually for most sizable cultivation facilities, you use metric as a tie-in through an API, ultimately with your own seed to sale, whether that's a Canix, a Dutchy, or any of these other seed to sale tracking systems. Um, that way you have single source entry. Ultimately, you'll enter into your system. It will push into metric. Metric will have it. Um, Anytime you create a manifest or anytime you submit for testing, you'll be using metric. So there will be some activities that you will have to make sure that select employees are trained on based on title. And because metric is forever, I rarely give everybody access to metric from a permission standpoint. Usually, I reserve that for just higher level leadership.
Nice. Another question we have here in our Q&A box is, how and where is testing of the product done? How long does the testing take? And do you actually, to add on to that question, separately, do you have to create like maybe a testing SOP, even though that's kind of like, testing labs are here? Is that something you need to sort of like document for your processes?
Usually, I have that aspect built into the flower package, for example. If we were doing a flower packaging activity, at the end of the flower packaging, when it's in a finished packaged product, but we have not yet applied our static label because we don't know our potency at that point, that is when we submit to the lab to come select their selection from our product, finished packaged, and including pre rolls, it would be in the cone that they would select. They will then take that product to their third party lab. How long does testing last? Testing lasts depend on how much you're having tested at that time. But
Mhm.
I would typically say the average would be usually no less than 5 days and no more than 10 days. And that should be in that week.
Well, those are all of the questions I gathered for us, and I appreciate everyone that dropped a question in the Q&A box. Just as we wrap up, Jason, is there anything that comes to mind when any kind of last nuggets that you want to give folks who are going down this adventure of building out a cultivation or in the process of applying?
It's it can be a frustrating time, but find the fun in the frustration.
Yeah.
Um, Look for those solutions, and again, try to think from an in perspective backwards, so that you can decide what path you want to take to ultimately hit your end result.
That's nice. And the question I ask all instructors who join us is, what would be an advantage of taking your course?
Having a lead to what to do. A lot of times, especially when it comes to SOPs, they can be so ambiguous that people can get lost in the details. What is this? How far do I need to create? And ultimately, it's a process of thinking about who is doing what, when, and where in your facility, and what do you want them to do? You just wrote an SOP.
I like that. Well, thank you so much, Jason, for joining us. Thank you, everyone that dialed in on this afternoon, this evening to tap in with us again. In case you missed this, this will be placed on our CTA website in the media catalogs. You can also catch this on social media. Jason will drop where to find you on LinkedIn. Again, be sure to check out Jason's course, Level 9B SOPs for Cultivation. And you have any questions, feel free to contact us through the CTA portal. If that's all, thank you everyone for joining and have a good rest of the evening.
Thanks, everyone.